any other profession, if you want to get a job in architecture, you need to have a CV. But how do architecture CVs differ from normal CVs? What do you include in them that's different from that? And what should you include that are also in normal CVs? Well, first things first, like any other CV, there are things you definitely shouldn't include. Some of these may actually surprise you, and they are anything pertaining to your age. So, date of birth, that should not be on there really. Not that there's anything to stop you putting it on there, but essentially prevents any age-based discrimination. Employers aren't allowed to ask you, or potential employers aren't allowed to ask you your age in an interview. And they shouldn't ask you it before an interview either. And likewise, it's illegal for them to actually discriminate against you based on your age. Also, they're not allowed to judge you based on your gender, not allowed to judge you based on your sexual orientation, and also not allowed to judge you based on your religious viewpoints as well. So, what this essentially means is if you get asked in relation to any of those questions, you should be very, very aware that they shouldn't be asking you those questions. But I think the main one here is date of birth. Date of birth is something that people usually put on their CVs, but it's usually advisable not to do this. Likewise, maybe remove your gender, and it's not necessary to put anything about your sexual orientation or religious viewpoints as well. Within this as well, a lot of people tend to put pictures on their CVs. And again, there's nothing to stop you doing this. And legally speaking, employers shouldn't use this as anything to discriminate against you with. But removing all these altogether prevent that from being an issue at all. And I think that's sort of something to really bear in mind from the starting point. And like I say, that applies to any CV, not just architecture CVs. But then that leads into, well, what should I put in my CV? Well, first things first is your background in terms of education. So where have you studied? What qualifications have you achieved? And I think within this as well, it's important to note that you don't necessarily need to put the qualification itself. Stating that you have the qualification as stated is a good starting point. However, if you've done really well in these, there's nothing to stop you putting them on there. However, it should be worth noting as well, the further you go in life, it may not be necessary to put certain qualifications on there. So if you're coming out at of school, say, and you're looking for a job, yeah, you'd want to maybe include your GCSEs, your SATs, maybe, I don't know. But at a higher level, maybe you want to go, so say you've got your master's degree, maybe you want to go as far back as GCSEs, but no further. But again, GCSEs, it's a case of maybe you need to put that on there. It's a tough one, but I think it's most pertinent qualification. I mean, personally, on mine, I still have I go as far back as GCSE, but you don't necessarily need to go back that far. So within that, you've got your qualifications, you've got your educational background. What comes next? Well, workplaces where you've worked, that's another key one to have. And for some people, this may be blank, and that's completely fine. You've got to start somewhere. Just to make sure the rest of your CV is quite strong to really get in there. But one thing to really bear in mind with this is don't be waffly, highlight the key points of what you achieved when you worked in each workplace, what your job role was, what your specific role expected you to do, and what you feel you personally gained from being in that role. I think that's really important. And the next big thing would be your personal statement. Now, this is an opportunity for you to be specific, talk about you, really, talk about your interests. It doesn't necessarily need to pertain to the role. This personal statement can include a bit about your hobbies, your interests, because at the end of the day, you're more than just the career. You are a person with interests outside of that, and it's something for your employer or potential employer to jump off and talk to you about. And those interests may influence jobs that are going on, and especially in architecture, you could have an interest in horse riding, for example, and your employer might be like, oh, we've working on a stable's conveniently enough. And it's something to talk about, and it's something they may want to talk to you about. They might want to gain your insight on that specific hobby or interest for a project. So what you put in there is quite important, really. Any kind of accolades as well, really. I know this is sort of come back to what's saying about education, but on top of that, accolades. So you may have won awards outside of education for jobs you've done, for anything really, and putting that on there, it sort of outlines what you're capable of, and it really shows up to a potential employer, what you could do, if you're part of the team, and it's a good thing to put on there. But again, what makes architecture CVs different from the rest? Well, this is where other things start to come into play, like travel. And anyone who studied architecture, like I mentioned before, you do study trips abroad, yeah, that's fine. But up until recently, now we've had Brexit, had Erasmus. And I personally did Erasmus and absolutely loved it, and I gained so much insight from doing it. So you may have an Erasmus experience that you might want to put in some things like that. But again, there's other stuff to really consider, and I think what you should always consider with any CV is, in a way, it's an aperitif. It's getting an employer sort of interested in you. They've got the CV. What makes you stand out above all other candidates? So with architecture especially, you will likely submit this with a portfolio. So in a way, teasing the portfolio and teasing your creativity is not a bad shout here. So one thing that a lot of people do is they have the CV done in a creative way, whether this is layout, colour schemes, that kind of thing. But one key thing that tends to happen a lot is examples of projects, just small things on the CV that kind of give an indicator of things you've worked on and, again, what you're capable of in architecture. And like I mentioned, it's kind of whetting your appetite for the portfolio. So if you've got a few interesting things on there, diving into them in detail in the portfolio, so you're explaining the project, that's not a bad shout, and it could really do you a fair few favours. So really, really consider that when going forward. And I think then that leads into, an architecture portfolio. What should you include in it? Well, this varies depending on where you are in your career. And I mean, for anyone, the starting point should be standout projects that you've done, be this at university or in your actual workplace. So starting off with university ones, this is something you want to update the further along you go. So a part 1 portfolio is going to be very different to part 2 portfolio, because you'll have done more and been a bit more depth, and you'll have grown. You'll have definitely see that in your work as well. That's not to say a part 2 portfolio may not include some part 1 work. I mean, I still include like a few pieces in there, but that's just mainly as just a few standout pieces that I put in there to have as reference point. And I think as well, within that, workplace projects really, really worthwhile putting there, because again, it shows what you can do in the workplace, and it shows a range of different things that you're capable of. So detail works you worked on in workplace, plans, sections, all that kind of stuff, and at different levels as well. So technical and planning stages are definitely worth considering. But yeah, so that's something to complement the CV. And like I say, anything that you put in the portfolio, you might want to explain it a bit just to add some context to it. And don't just throw a few odd pieces in. Actually spend time creating it. Think about how it comes off when it opens, because you want that to impress as well. But yeah, your CV is going to be the starting point for any potential employer. They're going to look at that, and you want them to read more from that. So considering what's on that CV is important. So going through everything that I've just mentioned, qualifications, education, personal statement, accolades, interests and hobbies. And another thing to really consider is actually references. Do not ever put your references details on your CV. I cannot stress that enough. I am aware of people who have done that and got themselves really, really, they've annoyed their references in a way, because if you put your references details on there, you're going to send it off and people are going to be contacting, and they're not going to be best pleased with you. So a good thing to always do with references is available on request, because that way, if an employer is interested in following it up, they will get in contact with you to get those details. And again, it stops your references getting annoyed at you because they're sort of getting hit up all the time by potential employers. And also, do not forget your contact details as well. So email address, phone number, and residence as well. So if any letters are sent out, they get sent to that address. And yes, funny enough, employers do still send out letters. I got a letter once about a job I'd applied for, and that one caught me off guard. It's rare, it doesn't happen too often, but it happens. But also within that, consider your email address that you're putting on your CV. I know for a lot of people this might sound common sense, but for example, if your name is kingnoob420 at whatever.com, then you're not exactly giving a professional appearance to you, and that's not what you want at all. So if you don't have an email address that kind of says anything that is kind of a bit childish or kind of a bit of a stupid joke, maybe just set up a new email address specifically for job applications and things like that. And there's nothing wrong with having numbers in the name. Just consider what the numbers are. For example, stay away from things like 420 and 69. You all know why. And yeah, so just setting out something like, Bob Smith 28 or something like that. Nothing wrong with that. And just consider how that might come across. So, maybe just if you don't want to have numbers in there because you're worried how that comes across, just, Bob E. Smith, just to kind of make sure you've kind of got that professional appearance to it, just so that it doesn't come across that you're immature or irresponsible in any way. And your CV should convey that as well. Don't forget to get it proofread. Don't forget to read through it yourself. And make sure you've got the important stuff in there. There's nothing wrong with changing it and changing it and changing it again. And the more people can get to read through it, the better. And I know a lot of universities kind of do modules on doing your CV, which you sort of get close to the part 1 placement, the part 2 placement. But just work with it, really. Spell checker is always a good one as well. Just think about the context, what you should say. I mean, remember, there and there are two different spellings, but your spell checker will put it through. But if you've got the wrong one on there, it might look a bit bad. But yeah, so again, remember the basics when it comes to CVs. It can never do you wrong to just consider that. So yeah, hopefully that addresses any big stuff about the CVs. But anything else, please feel free to ask them below. I will do my best to answer. And of course, some of you are going to disagree with what I've said in here. But again, please feel free to put that down below, because some of it may be right. I know there's a lot you want to put in a CV, but you should always try and convey. That's another thing as well. Try and keep it to 2 pages at most. And that's going to be one of the hardest things to do. And don't forget, as you sort of go through new jobs as well, a bit like what I was saying about the education stuff, you might want to drop stuff off from those segments after a while. So, if you've worked at several architecture practices and you've still got your CV a bar job you did, you might want to drop the bar job from there. It probably isn't worth keeping on your CV. Because also it may not be very relevant as well if you are applying to architecture jobs. So yeah, it's really worth considering that. So yeah, like I say, any comments, leave them down below. Feel free to give this video a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to get notified when there's new videos that come out. Until next time, I'll talk to you later.